We're all going to have to serve somebody. We're all going to serve one of those wolves. We're going to feed them. We're going to say yes to what they have to say. Which one is it going to be? If you're an American or you've lived in America for a significant amount of time, then you are connected to the prejudice that we spoke of this morning. How do we respond to that? Many of us have seen the Washington Post article, What White People Need to Know and Do After Ferguson. In it, Sally Cohn reminds us that responsibility isn't the same as culpability. It is not your fault that Michael Brown was shot and killed, or that we have a deep structural bias in America, but that bias is nonetheless a reality, and so you have a responsibility as to whether you're part of the problem or part of the solution. Which wolf will you feed? Who you gonna serve? It hurts to keep our hearts open and stay present for the pain of racism. But that's what church is for. We're stronger together. I guarantee you that if I didn't have this role, I would not have spent the amount of time reading and watching videos and learning and wrestling and having sleeplessness and indigestion if it weren't for some accountability to come here and help us process together. I noticed in the last service when I was preaching that there's this I feel emotional protection coming up. For a while I was preaching, I just felt kind of numb. And I'm asking you to not let yourself go into numbness, and I'm going to try real hard, but I'm afraid that if I don't, I'm just going to lose it. So I'm going to do my best, but you can get more emotional than me, okay? Because this is part of our commitment to one another, that we will encounter the world around us, that we will be open to life and prepared to serve. Someone in this church said this to me recently: how do we help people be prepared to serve? Well, that's part of the purpose of my sermon this morning, is that we'll actually engage the world around us so that we're better prepared to respond when we hear and see things in our lives and in our communities. The exercise this morning, we had Darren Wilson and Michael Brown, but it could have been so many others. I contemplated, I don't know if you've seen the post Tim Wise posted online about the shooting of the 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, how after that happened, if you've seen it, I mean, you have to see this. It's just literally unbelievable how quickly that shooting happens. And also John Crawford in Cleveland, Ohio. But after Tamir Rice was shot, the police officers there didn't offer any first aid for 4.5 minutes. An FBI agent came on the scene and said, "Have you called an ambulance?" And then they started doing first aid. How does that happen? I contemplated just doing a 4.5 minute silence to just contemplate standing and seeing a child hurting like that. This is horrific. How does that happen? How does that happen? In some of the cases, we hear that fear played an ultimate role, fear for one's life. But we also know, while that's a real phenomenon and people's brains shift and they lose access to their frontal lobe and they can't process in the same way, they don't have access to all of their thinking resources under stress. We know that's a real phenomenon, but we also know that's not the whole story of what's going on here. People are not throwing protests and having uprisings because of people's individuals' fear. They're protesting the filter through which that fear appears. Fearing for one's life may be happening, but it does not exist in a vacuum. People are fearing for their lives within this continuum of preconceived notions based on race. And to be more specific, white people are fearing black skin. We hear it in the video that went viral this week. If you saw the African-American man who posted in Pontiac, Michigan, that he was stopped by a police officer while he was walking down the street, and this is a little bit of the dialogue that begins midstream. He filmed it and posted on Facebook. And the officer said, "You were walking by." And the man says, "Walking by and doing what?" "You were making people nervous." "By walking by?" Yeah, they said you had your hands in your pockets. Wow. Walking by having your hands in your pocket makes people nervous, and they call the police when it's snowing outside. Later, the police officer said they've had a lot of robberies in the area, so he was checking. The police said that the caller had said that he was walking back and forth in front of a store a few times like he was casing the place. This did not appease the man walking with his hands in his pockets. And why should it? You may have seen the essay online that Mark Stringer posted, our senior minister, on his Facebook page. That was an article written by Keith, I think that's how you say his name, Lamon, who is a faculty member at Vassar College. And he, in his essay, shared stories of being black and being asked for his ID by campus security in his own office when he'd worked there for years. And he had pictures of his mother and himself all over the place. He tells a story about 3 African-American senior women students confronting the head of security and the dean of the college because they didn't think they should get the security called on them for doing laundry and reading books. He tells a story of teenage African-American boys walking through Vassar's library on a Sunday afternoon and that they were making too much noise. And so security was called. And when they asked the boys for IDs, being 15 and 16 years old, they didn't have IDs to produce, some of them. And so the police were called, who drove up on the lawn in front of the library. Oh, in time, the boys were released, but days later, some of those police officers followed up with these teenage boys, interrupting their classroom to ask them if they knew anything about missing cell phones and iPods on Vassar campus. When the boy said no, the officer said, "Don't go back to Vassar again." Professor Lamon writes, "There is no way on earth that a 15-year-old black child visited by police officers at his own school for walking through a library while black is gonna be okay. And neither are we. You can't walk through a library. You can't play in the park. You can't pick up a pellet gun in a store. You can't stand outside a store. You can't walk across the street, and you can't drive your Ford Taurus. We have an epidemic of white fear of black people in this country. And I know that racism is not just about black and white people, and neither is racial tension with the police. I also know that our congregation is not all white and that my experience of this is going to be different than other people's. I also know that it's not only white people who have been indoctrinated to feel fear of people of color, and it's not just white people who can perpetuate this fear of people of color. Yet this is part of the devastating reality that we have all inherited. It's in us, and it's beyond us. We're not culpable, perhaps, but we are responsible. We say at the end of every service, we are open to life and prepared to serve. And if we're gonna be prepared to serve, then we have to look at white fear and white oppression of brown and black people. And this fear is just one of the many facets of racism. It's been intentionally woven into the origins of our nation to maintain a privileged place for some, an overprivileged, and an underprivileged place for others. We have to talk with each other about it, because if we can't admit there is a wolf, and we can't speak about those perceptions out loud, then we can't examine them. I don't know if anyone saw The Daily Show this week, and Jon Stewart was talking with their senior black correspondent, and they said that we have a raceaholic problem in this country. And Jon Stewart said, "Do you think we'll ever get a 30-day chip?" And the correspondent said, "We can't even admit we have a problem. First you have to admit you have a problem, and then you have to ask for help, right? You have to be able to talk about it to even get to 30-day chip." So if we can't, thank God for their humor, to keep us engaged. I'm sorry I don't have more for you today. I'm really troubling the waters. because I don't know how else to do this. But if we can't examine these perceptions, then we can't choose to take a step beyond them, to actually see each other, to actually re-engage that creative interchange, to be open ourselves to what is life here. And when we see that when white society doesn't name, when we as white people don't name all of these perceptions, then these fears rooted in bias are considered reasonable grounds for defense in a trial by majority white jurors. According to Missouri law, the term reasonable belief means that a belief based on reasonable grounds, that is, grounds that could lead a reasonable person in the same situation to the same belief. This depends upon how the facts appeared. It does not depend upon whether the belief turned out to be true or false. So in America, white people like me are saying, oh, you had all these things come into your head. Well, that's reasonable. That might happen to me too. That's a reasonable fear. And then people aren't held accountable for murder. Not that this man isn't a victim also in that moment. I don't know that Darren Wilson is a sociopath and is set out to really murder and is full of hate. That it's a sickness that gets us all. But what is going on if white American juries are declaring this fear of people of color is reasonable? How is that reasonable? And this is what people are protesting. One of the manifestations of racism that people are protesting, that they can't take it anymore, that white people are saying it's reasonable to fear us walking through the library, down the street, in the grocery store, in the park, any of these situations. And why should people take that? Why is it reasonable? Fearing black people for merely being black is not reasonable. There must be reason that it seems so reasonable. People aren't just totally crazy, right? Well, we hear this, right? This might be another one of those perceptions where people want to back up and say, no, it's really makes sense that we would be scared of black skin. Well, good, we've heard it said out loud. We heard the former mayor Rudy Giuliani talking about this a little too much in my opinion, but on TV the past few weeks, and he said, the danger to a black child in America is not a white police officer. That's going to happen less than 1% of the time. The danger to a black child, if it was my child, the danger is another black. How many of you have heard somebody recently say something like this? We need to focus on black crime, not on what police officers are doing. Okay. So that's one of the perceptions in the lineup. We've named it. So now let's step back and let the other wolf come out and look at what that actually means. Research does show that 90% of black Americans are killed by other black Americans. Research also shows that 83% of white Americans are also killed by other white Americans. It is just what happens. Most crime and violence happens within people's own racial group, with the people they know and where they live. Giuliani also said, white police only patrol black neighborhoods because they have higher crime rates. Okay, it's another one of the beliefs in the lineup. Let's step back and look at what that actually means. Slate magazine put out an article that showed how this is historically inaccurate. They wrote, heavy-handed policing in black neighborhoods by predominantly white departments goes back to the middle of the last century and was a key factor in the riots that rocked the urban landscape in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. More importantly, white police departments heavily policing black neighborhoods predates the high crime rates that Giuliani cited as his justification. If we look at studies about crime and violence in America, FBI statistics report that African Americans are not especially criminal. A Daily Beast article wrote that if they were, you would expect to see high rates of crime among blacks, even as the nation's historic decline in criminal offenses has happened. But instead, you see crime rates among African Americans and black youth in particular have also taken a sharp drop. Overall, figures show that among Black youth, rates of robbery, property offenses are at their lowest rate in 40 years, as are the rates of violent crime and victimization. Black on black crime has been part of the American lexicon for decades, but as a specific phenomenon, it's no more real than white on white crime. How many of you have heard lots of people talking about white on white crime lately? You ever heard that term before? That says a lot, doesn't it? It's good to say these things out loud and put them on this continuum that the other wolf can come out and be curious. Because sometimes it sounds like real or honest, like that's the only story, but it's not always the case. I want to talk about another one of those ideas that exists along the continuum, which is the fear that white people have of Black people, that they're supernaturally strong or vicious. And this is not something you may readily think, oh yeah, I always think that. Yet we hear it in Wilson's testimony. Officer Wilson said that while he was shooting Brown, it looked like he was almost bulking up to run through the shots, like it was making him mad that I was shooting at him. That's what humans do when we're shot multiple times. Wilson, who was within 2 inches, the same height as Brown, they were very close in height and within 60 pounds or so in their bodies. And yet Officer Wilson said, the only way I can describe it is I felt like a 5-year-old holding onto Hulk Hogan. He's huge. Later, he said of his encounter with Brown, he looked up at me and had the most intense, aggressive face. The only way I can describe it, it looks like a demon. In the same moment that he superhumanizes him, bulking up, he also makes him subhuman. It was a demon. This is where I would cry if I wasn't leading the sermon right now. We do this to each other. We swim in these waters. Sociologists tell us about this from Northwestern University. They recently put out a study where they looked at how white people do this superhumanization and dehumanization of Black people. They asked white internet users, they showed them a picture of a white face and a Black face, and then they asked them things like, which person is more likely to have superhuman skin that is thick enough that it can withstand the pain of burning hot coals? People responded, which person has supernatural strength that makes them capable of lifting up a tank? They asked many other questions similar to that, and the white respondents answered 65% of the time that Black people were more likely to be superhuman than the white person. Similarly, whites claimed that when it was something around pain, that the Black person was less likely to feel pain than the white person. That whites were susceptible to pain 69% more of the time. The authors of the paper say that this finding about pain could explain the fact that Black hospital patients, they receive less pain medication than white patients do. We don't even see each other as people. Breaks my heart. The assumption of less pain and greater strength could also lead to support for police brutality against Blacks. Their study suggests that the superhuman bias could explain why Black juveniles are judged more culpable for their crimes than whites. They're seen as more capable, more adult, more responsible for their actions. Ron Paul wrote in a 1992 newsletter, "We don't think a child of 13 should be held responsible as a man of 23. That's true for most people, but Black males age 13 who've been raised on the streets and who have joined criminal gangs are as big, strong, tough, and scary and culpable as any adult and should be treated as such." We have got to talk about how we as white people hold these ideas that superhumanize and dehumanize each other. A sociologist said, superhumanization in the end is just dehumanization in a cape. So when we hear people among us saying that the white fear of black people creates aggression that robs people of their humanity, we have a choice to make. We can turn towards that trouble and that conversation, or we can shut it off. People of all colors right now in all communities are asking themselves, what does it look like for me to turn towards that trouble? What can we do differently? As a white person, I'm particularly drawn to the particular invitation from Tanya Steele, who wrote this after George Zimmerman walked free. She said, we African Americans can talk about this until the cows come home. When are we going to have a town hall on racism where white people discuss how they will speak to their children to make sure another George Zimmerman doesn't walk among us? When are we going to have a town hall on racism that addresses how a jury of women, predominantly white women and mothers, don't identify with a black child? We have to demand that white people speak up in conversations about racism, not race, but racism. While we tell our 1,000th story about being accosted, turn and ask a white person, what are you learning from this? How will you change as a result of hearing this? How has the verdict impacted you and changed your life going forward? Something. The parade of black grief while white folks sit and stare has to cease. So let's be those people. Let's hold a town hall on racism, or town halls. We're not going to do it in one session. Let's hold town halls. Let's come together and answer her questions. How are we going to inoculate our children against the racist waters they swim in? Many research has shown that many white liberals think that if you put your children in a diverse school and you say things like, everybody's equal, God made all of us, we're all the same under our skin, that those children will be colorblind or be less inclined to be racist. But one of the researchers who worked on trying to figure out how do we inoculate our children, she said these things to her kid, and then her 5-year-old said to her, Mommy, what does equal mean? And she said, you have to be more specific. You have to say things the same way that boys and girls are like, what is that? I don't have that. You have to explain. You can't just say we don't have differences. We have to say we have differences. But the same way you say, mommies can be doctors just like daddies, we have to say everybody can be doctors, everybody. We have to go deeper than that. Because when children in diverse schools and their parents didn't talk to them about race, which most white people, liberal, anti-racist people don't do actually, these children in the research, they were asked, how many white people are mean? And children commonly answered almost none. And when they were asked how many black children or black people are mean, they said some or a lot, despite their parents' best intentions. So how are we going to inoculate our kids against racism? How are we going to inoculate ourselves? What are we learning from what we're hearing? Our intern minister, Linda Barnes, is going to be downstairs in room 103 to hold space for dialogue, for you to contemplate these questions if you so choose this morning, like I did last week, that same space. A few church members are working with me to develop a small group ministry packet that you can use in your Soul Matters group, or that any group of 6 to 10 people can get together to think about these readings, to do some more. What is on this continuum? How do we name it and examine it? How do we talk to our children about that? How do we talk to our family members? How do we talk to our legislators? How do we talk to our police and our newspapers? How do we do that? So be looking for that in the next month. We'll be creating opportunities. Perhaps you'll attend the class on mass incarceration and racism that a member of our church, Harvey Harrison, will be leading. The past few years, he's taught about the new Jim Crow. This year, he's focusing more on the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration and the disproportionate police contact with people of color in Iowa. So it's not just out there, we're talking here. And we're going to be looking at specific projects that are going on in our community that if you're of that mind that you want to create policy change or have a study done of racial profiling, get some funding to pay for that, to really look in depth at what is going on in Des Moines. He will have all kinds of, I called him and he rattled off like 10 of them in 20 minutes on the phone. He's really well informed. So maybe you'll attend that class, or maybe you're sparked by this thought of how will we inoculate our children? As you may notice, I'm only one person. I can't do all of these things. So if you have skills and community connections that can help us pass an ordinance to end racial profiling in Des Moines, come talk to me. I can get you connected. If you're a person who has facilitator skills and you would be open to holding one of these small group ministry sessions, come talk to me. We'll connect you with people. Or if you want to think about how do we inoculate our children, come talk to me. We'll do some research. We'll hold some town halls so that together we can figure out how we want to do this differently than it's been done before. We are stronger together. Alone can be overwhelming and too hard to even click on the videos to see what has happened. But collectively, we join with others to help guide our care and our beliefs into action in a way that can make real change. So let us do that. Let us not just feel about this and walk away. Let us hold ourselves to what we say and be open to life and prepare each other to serve, so that we can bring our love to this hurting world. Amen.